Two little sisters abandoned by their father in hunger. Until a cowboy found them, Dusty Hollow baked beneath a sun that turned skin to parchment, and patience into thin smoke. Lila Mayfield pressed Emma against her ribs, feeling ribs like knuckles and a small pulse that trembled with each diminished breath. Voices gathered like vultures in the alley, polishing cruelty into spectacle, while Margaret Voss, silk immaculate and smile like a blade, presented a ruined horse as if gifting pity were entertainment. Rusty stood crooked, one eye clouded, an old scar running along a flank. Still something ancient rode behind those weary sockets. A memory, a promise, a secret stamped into muscle. Lila smelled hay, sweat and coin. She heard laughter that tasted like iron. Around them wagers clicked, fingers flicked coins and children dared each other to jeer. Emma counted silently, whispering numbers like prayers, naming colors she had not seen for days. Lila folded into the animal's heat, fingers mapping ridges, finding a tremor that was not fear but coiled strength. In the crowd, a woman in quiet fabric held back tears she would not explain. A former hand leaned with weathered forearms and eyes that weighed wrong choices. A stranger's whistle cut the murmur. Boots stopped. A folded photograph slipped from someone's pocket and fluttered against dust. A boy in uniform. A horse rearing on a prairie horizon. The paper vanished under boot, but the image planted a question the town could not shake. Who claimed ownership of the loss? Rusty blinked, nostrils lifting as if remembering a finish line, a name shouted long ago. Lila's jaw set. Emma's thin fingers found a braid and tugged like a lifeline. The crowd leaned. Silence tightened into expectation. Someone muttered a name linked to old whispers. A loss that cracked open more questions than answers now. What happens next will leave you stunned. Dusty Hollow woke each morning with a dry sigh, roofs baking under an unrelenting sun, while wind swept dust across splintered porches and limp laundry. Behind the town's faded storefronts, hidden from polite eyes, a low shed leaned crooked against a fence, its boards ragged and patched with scavenged nails. Inside that hollow, Lila Mayfield moved with quiet precision, tending a small stove that spat more smoke than heat and setting 2 tin plates on a warped table for the two of them. She learned hunger as though it were weather, first a sharp edge, then a dull, constant ache that narrowed thoughts and sharpened resolve. Scavenging under shuttered stalls and trading chores for coffee grounds, she saved jarred coins and paid favors with steady hand. When morning light fell on the town square, she kept to the shadows, listening for voices that might spill more bread than rumor. Emma slept in the corner on a pallet of straw, ribs outlined beneath thin fabric, and Lila smoothed a rag over the small knuckles before slipping outdoors. The annual race threaded through Dusty Hollow's calendar like scripture. It arrived with banners and betting slips, with men in new boots and women who wore their fortunes as armor. For Lila, the track shimmered as an escape route, a place where skill and heart could outpace pedigree. She spoke of it softly to Emma, turning possibility into a plan she could hold like a coin. The dream hardened into a rope she could climb. Word traveled quickly, and gossip curdled into conviction. Tales about the Voss family's generosity mixed with sharper whispers about pride and cruelty. Margaret Voss presided from a ranch on a rise, its painted shutters closing pity away from prying eyes. She kept her distance with the precision of someone who had learned to protect absence, and her manners could slice as neatly as any blade. Rose, her niece, moved close to those rules while carrying a softer gravity. Her hands were used to saddles and the smell of horsehair, and her eyes sheltered a secret she dared not name. Caleb Dunn watched events from the cracked top rail of a fence, a man whose face remembered too many winters and whose patience had been burned slow by sun. Once he had trained horses for money and regard, now he traded stories for small comforts and offered advice that landed like splinters but mattered. When he spoke of a horse called Starfire, his voice slowed, tasting pride and loss alike. That name had softened over the years into Rusty, because time and tragedy change how people speak of glory. He dropped hints in Lila's path with the kind of careful speech that teaches without exposing. Margaret's grudges were practical things that tightened simple lives. She could summon law enforcement officers with a tone and drown complaints with charity that arrived wrapped in conditions. If someone displeased her, consequences followed measured steps. Lila learned to read those measures early, where Margaret paced people bent. Yet the wealthy woman carried grief like an undercurrent, a folded wound beneath sharp collars. Rumor claimed she had lost a son who loved one horse beyond reason, and that private sorrow had hardened into public edge. Rusty existed at the edge of that sediment. His coat marked healed wounds, and one flank still flexed with memory where muscle had split long ago. At dusk he stamped and snorted at shadows only he could follow. Lila's first visit felt like touching an artifact. She ran her fingers along scar tissue and found warmth that answered in kind. The horse's gaze measured her in long, careful moments, as if appraising a companion rather than offering relic status. Training began in small increments. Lila learned to lead without yanking, to set voice to command, and to read the subtle language of hoof. She practiced when town lights dimmed and the racetrack lay silent, Rusty following with cautious grace, their shadows long on cracked earth. Emma watched from the shed's threshold, cheerfulness a fragile shield that steadied them both. At night they lay with faces turned to the sky, and Lila whispered plans that turned fear into a private engine. Rose supplied herbs and soft blankets under the nose of propriety, slipping small kindnesses into the girl's world when her aunt's back was turned. Each gentle act risked exposure, her loyalty balanced on household rules and compassion. She moved like someone who had learned to hide generosity behind duty, and when she leaned into the shed doorway, her cheeks betrayed worry and care. Margaret's presence remained a constant pressure. Rose's gestures were quiet rebellions, whose consequences tasted dangerous. A man named Jasper Reed circled at a distance with a market's appraisal. He owned a rival tax supply and liked to remind Dusty Hollow that alliances could be bought. He watched Lila and Rusty with thin smiles, ready to pounce where profit smelled. Town bets often followed his cues and he scattered half-truths to shape expectation in his favor. Fear threaded each day in practical way. A ranch hand reported visitors to the shed with the precision of someone who feared consequence more than conscience. His footsteps scraped outside at odd hours and Lila learned to answer with looks. A narrowed eye to mean caution, a quick nod to mean run, a forced grin to mean courage. She hid tools in straw, spread extra feed across 2 bowls and taught Emma to ration without revealing the scale of scarcity. The work of survival became so ingrained that it became second nature, a part of muscle memory. Caleb brought lessons about patience. He led them to a flat ribbon of land outside town and showed Lila how to set a hoof and ask for a trot rather than demand a gallop. Trust then guide, he told her, cupping hands as if framing a small future. His gruffness melted around Rusty. The animal recognized a kindred expertise. Under his guidance, Lila's confidence sharpened into focus, and Rusty's steps grew surer by degrees. One evening as storm clouds mounted over distant mesas, Lila and Rose sat by the shed and traded stories in low voices. Rose spoke of an uncle who had loved a horse like kin, and Lila held Mary Mayfield's photograph like a talisman. The image carried a smile that anchored memory, and both girls felt the town's long sorrow echo in their own small losses. Storm wind moved in like an approaching judge, bringing the scent of rain and a reminder that weather could both give and take. In the shed's dim corner, Emma hummed a thin tune and Lila hummed back to drown the distant roar of coming wind. Rusty shifted, nostrils lifting as if he too heard a drumbeat far off. That night the town's lights blinked early as people closed shutters against the storm, and inside the crooked shelter a fragile plan took a steadier shape. Lila pictured crossing the track at first light, timing Rusty's stride to her breath and weaving a future from courage, care and precise choices. She imagined a finish line where strength would lift them from hunger and a fragile mercy would await them at the finish, allowing them to celebrate their victory. Night wrapped Dusty Hollow like a shawl, and stars hung low, bright as promises shelved for better mornings. Lila worked by a single oil lamp, fingers moving with practiced care as she brushed Rusty's flank, each pass removing dust and revealing the horse's history, healed scars, puckered hide, and the faint oval where a brand had once read Starfire. Emma slept on a straw pallet nearby, curled small against the cold, breath shallow but steady. Lila whispered to the animal as though speaking could stitch hunger into courage. Her voice was low and steady, shaped by necessity rather than rehearsal. "We're tougher than they think," she murmured, and felt the phrase settle into her ribs like a small hot coal. The horse answered with a soft exhale, nostrils flaring, breath warm against her wrist. She mapped his scars with fingers that had been patched, torn and bound to scraped knees. Each mark told a story she wanted to learn. Caleb arrived without drama, the kind that suited someone whose life was measured in slow reckonings rather than swift shows. He carried an old tarpaulin, and the scent of tobacco and rain. When he settled on a crate across from Lila, he avoided grand statements. Instead he offered observations that felt like tools. "That one ran for keeps once," he said, voice rough but not unkind. Name was Starfire. Knew the track like a man knows his boots. He paused, watching Lila's hand move, eyes narrowing. Lila's hands stopped, mid-stroke. Starfire. The name landed with a hollow click, an echo that expanded the shed into a map of past cheering crowds, a finish line she had only imagined. For a moment she pictured a young rider hugging the neck of a winning horse. The crowd awash of hats and clapping palms, and the image hung like contraband in the dim room. Emma stirred and blinked, bewildered by the sudden shift, then smiled at Lila with fragile trust. Caleb pulled a flaking photograph from his pocket, and let it rest on his knee, thumb smoothing a corner. The paper held a figure, small against a rearing horse, grin wide with an urgency time had softened. He belonged to Voss's boy, Caleb said, voice drifting like smoke. Once he ran like thunder, and folks swore he'd never tire. Then something went sideways. The older man's jaw tightened. Lila leaned forward to see. The lamp made the image small and sacred. The stallion sniffed the photograph with careful curiosity, ears twitched. In that moment, the animal's breath and the image braided together, and Lila felt a connection beyond need. The horse was not merely a broken mount but a creature tethered to a life she could honor. She imagined Starfire's hooves churning dirt, remembered Caleb's never tire, and for the first time allowed herself to think the race might be more than a gamble. Emma sat up, rubbing sleep from eyes that had learned hunger's boredom. She watched Lila and Rusty with an attention that made Lila's heart widen. "Do you think he remembers?" Emma asked, voice thin but sharp with hope. Lila chose each word like a coin, careful not to promise beyond truth. "I think he remembers the feel of running," she said. "I think he remembers being more than what people toss aside." Caleb leaned forward, the angle of his body giving weight to the counsel he offered. "You don't rush him," he said. "You earn it. Don't box him in with fear. Ask, wait, let him answer." He had seen animals bend to certainty or break under undue pressure. His method was patience, teaching Lila how to ask without commanding. Training under starlight became a ritual. Lila practiced simple commands first, soft leads, steady walks, asking for rhythm rather than speed. The horse answered in increments, giving small tokens of trust. A step closer, an ear turned, a relaxed breath. Each concession rusted away doubt and added a thin ribbon of possibility. Emma clapped softly when Rusty offered a new movement, and their joy unspooled quietly across the dusty ground. Neighbors murmured, as rumors often do, traveling faster than the intention. Some called it madness for a girl to back a wounded animal into hope. Others tucked skepticism into pockets and offered knowing nods. Rose's interventions increased, discreet deliveries of feed and salve threaded with glances that promised secrecy. She moved with hands skilled by care, her presence a steady if risky kindness. For Rose, the act of helping felt like repayment to a memory she could not name. At night, Lila cradled small victories like fragile things, a smoother gait, a lighter breath, a softer eye. She worked at the saddle until leather fit Rusty's flank like a second skin rather than a foreign weight. She practiced balance by leaning into motion and correcting with subtle shifts, learning to become an extension of the animal. Caleb corrected her posture with blunt metaphors and patient hands, teaching muscle memory by example. An undercurrent of danger ran alongside these quiet improvements. Margaret's name circulated like a lead weight. Her patience carried edges. Her capacity for control translated into threats that could unmake fragile gains. Lila kept a lookout for ranch hands in distant shadows, and avoided public confrontation. When a rider passed with Voss colors, she lowered her head and let the world assume what it wished. This calculation was as much about survival as it was about strategy. One evening a storm's edge brushed the mesa, and lightning drew a silver thread across the horizon. Rusty shivered, though the air held no chill. His flanks twitched like someone remembering a drum roll. Lila tightened the reins gently, speaking into the thunder with a voice that carried both command and comfort. The horse answered by stepping into the rhythm of movement, and for a breath they moved together like a single thing, recalling its purpose. Caleb watched, mouth a line of approval, then said quietly, "That's the heart." He still knows. Lila let the words in, as if savoring water after a drought. Inside the shed, Emma hummed a new melody, one that matched confidence with a softness that made Lila think of small hands finding footholds. Before Caleb left that night, he placed a small coin into Lila's palm from a pocket no one knew he kept. "Use it for oats," he said. "Not for show." Lila closed her fingers and felt the coin's cool certainty. It was a small lifeline. She looked at Rusty and then at the photograph, and in that alignment something like a plan tightened into place. As they extinguished the lamp and Dusty Hollow settled into nocturnal hush, Lila lay awake thinking of finish lines and small mercy. Outside, distant silhouettes hummed with speculation and wonder. Children told versions that grew braver with each retelling, and older men who had once bet against miracles shifted in their seats, admitting smiles as sometimes an overlooked thing can change more than just a ray. The horse breathed steady, a metronome in the night, and in that cadence she heard an old promise whisper forward. Strength sometimes sleeps until someone remembers how to wake it. Have you ever seen strength where others saw weakness? That's the spark driving this story. The corral lay like an open wound behind town, fence posts splintered, and the ground a patchwork of cracked earth and hoofprints. Lila led Rusty into the arena at dawn, the sky pale and the air cool with promise. She tied a frayed rope and walked the perimeter, sensing every uneven stone and rabbit hole where a misstep might unbalance a stride. Her palms were raw from practice, calloused crescents that marked the work she had earned. Hunger had taught her an economy of motion. Each step was calculated to anticipate where traction might fail or momentum might rescue her from a stumble. Emma's thin shadow watched from the shed mouth, eyes bright with a faith Lila guarded like a secret flame. Voices clustered at the corral edge as the town gathered, hats tipped, wagers counted on the margin of a scrap. Children learned cruelty early, echoing adult laughter as if practicing the sound of contempt. Men marked bets in hurried ink, and Jasper Reed hovered with the greedy calm of someone who measured advantage as currency. Lila felt each look press against her shoulders. They expected collapse and took comfort in that expectation. Rusty shifted under the weight of judgment, a slight tremor running through old muscle. She pressed a steady palm along his flank and felt the beat of life steady beneath scarred hide. Margaret Voss arrived in boots that left no story on the dirt, wearing the kind of poise built to shape other people's choices. Her voice carried like a seal placed on a document. "You should quit," she said, measured and cold. "Accept aid on my terms." The crowd leaned into the cadence of her command. Her presence narrowed the scope of decisions. Lila's answer was short and even. "We'll see," she said, not pleading but not defiant for the crowd's sake either. A refusal anchored in quiet will. Around them, wagers tightened and gossip set the bounds of possibility. Jasper's mutters pushed men to line their coins. Others folded skepticism into curiosity and edged closer to watch a life either break or bend. Rusty, scarred from previous seasons, sniffed at a world that had already pronounced him spent. Lila adjusted the saddle, learning balance in increments, letting trust guide more than force. Each small concession from the horse, an ear turned, a softer breath seemed like a covenant. Emma clapped softly at a new step, and the sound flickered across the corral like a small flag. Rose moved like a quiet wind, slipping blankets and stale bread when eyes were elsewhere. She lingered at the fence with careful glances, hands tracing the worn weave of rope as if tracking loyalty. One dusk she leaned close and breathed a name that landed like a key. Starfire. The word folded the past into the present. It stitched Rusty to a life Lila had only half imagined. The admission braided Lila into a lineage of care she had not known she wanted. Margaret's threats had the shape of formalities. She could press a claim that would look routine on paper and decisive in court. Talk of ownership settled like dust over the girl's plans, momentarily blurring edges. Lila tallied favors and debts, Caleb's blunt lessons, Rose's secret kindnesses, the coin pressed into her palm at night. That ledger of survival balanced on gestures small enough to seem accidental but sturdy enough to hold. Training grew into a ritual. Lila set poles, practiced circles and transitions, asking rhythm instead of demanding speed because she had learned that force fractures trust. Rusty's gait lengthened, footprints drawing neater arcs in red dust. Each improvement carried murmurs of awe threaded with disbelief. Some watched with warmth, others with the sharpened interest of gamblers who preferred to profit from collapse. The town's attention became a pressure both dangerous and clarifying. It taught her to turn spectacle into focus. "You have until the fair," Margaret said once, voice flat as stamped coin. "Withdraw and accept my assistance, or I will file for possession." The ultimatum landed with the hard click of metal. Lila's breath tightened, threats rearranged necessity. She chose words like tools and replied, "We'll race." The declaration was a hinge, a condition she could own and answer by action rather than by bargaining. Caleb worked at her side like a man shaping a brittle board into something useful. He taught timing more than force, how to feel a stride and match it, how to shift weight with a subtle turn so momentum carried rather than threatened balance. He corrected posture with hands that steadied without subtracting dignity. Under his guidance, Lila learned to become an extension of the animal, not its master. Danger threaded each day in practical tones. Ranch hands reported glimpses of practice in a voice that contained consequence rather than curiosity. Lila learned to read those tones. A clipped report meant surveillance would intensify. A polite question meant someone was taking a measured advantage. She hid tack beneath loose boards and kept a list of who owed what favor. Survival demanded tidy schemes and the ability to answer a challenge without letting fear dictate the outcome. One afternoon, a formal notice appeared nailed to the post. The race would be official, with prize money and ownership awarded based on finish placement, and disputes adjudicated by appointed officials. Jasper's wagers hardened into public betting, and the town folded into calculation. Suddenly the contest was not only about speed, but also about law and leverage. The outcome could redraw the line between charity and control. By the time the notice traveled through the streets, Rusty's step had grown sure beneath Lila. The animal moved as if memory were a muscle wake. The corral had become a precarious stage where class and kindness performed. Margaret's glare insisted on order. Jasper's whispers sold certainty. Rose's quiet deliveries stitched rebellion into small comforts. Night sessions under a thin moon taught patience. Lila walked in circles while Rusty tested her intent, offering softer responses each time she asked without pushing. Emma sometimes watched from the doorway, eyes bright with small stubborn hope. For all the town's scheming acts of care held their ground. A neighbor left water where no one expected. A child slipped an apple with sticky palms. As Dusty Hollow tightened focus, Lila learned to turn pressure into preparation. Bets swelled and so did her discipline. She practiced starts and counted breath, mounting at odd hours to avoid notice. The more people predicted failure, the more she refined her strategy. Each day of labor stacked into quiet confidence, heavier than any coin but lighter than surrender. When a storm arced on the horizon, Rusty shivered though rain had not yet reached them. He raced as if answering a distant call, and for a single heartbeat, history and future aligned beneath Lila. The town waited, wagers clenched and voices hushed. In that hush she understood that the race would test more than speed. It would test who could claim a fragile hope and hold on to it. The morning Margaret returned, she walked the corral like a judge, stopping where Rusty stood, her nostrils quivering. Her demand was public and small: withdraw, accept aid on her terms, or lose the right to shelter and beast. The crowd cheered at the theater of power. Gamblers counted coins and called outcomes with practiced cruelty. Jasper's men drifted close, a purse held out like an offer to erase trouble. Lila slid the coin into her palm but did not fold to barter. Rusty tested the ground, one hoof uncertain on riven soil, and Lila braced, voice calm, action precise. Rose lingered near a post, blanket clenched, eyes rimmed with fear. In that charged hush, Lila picked resolve over surrender and kept the narrow stake of hope alive. Caleb stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Lila's shoulder and offering a plan. Train smarter, not harder. Test Rusty's revival in controlled starts. Show the town a truth none could dismiss. The storm struck Dusty Hollow with blunt force, tossing tin and sending dust into rooms where sleep had tried to dwell. Rusty had shown steady improvement for days. Lila could feel subtle changes in his step, a firmer placement of hoof, and a head that answered her voice. Those small gains felt fragile and precious in a town that preferred the comfort of certainty. Rain hammered the shed. Lila tightened tarpaulins and drew Emma beneath a thin blanket while the horse shifted uneasily in his stall. A sudden slip in the churned ground caught a hind leg, and Rusty fell with a heavy thud that made Lila taste iron. She was at his side immediately, hands slick and quick, searching for swelling and heat. The joint flexed at an awkward angle and a thin, frightened sound came from the animal. Lila steadied her breath and moved with purpose because panic had no cure and work might. Caleb arrived soaked, hat brim clinging to his forehead, stepping through mud with a steady gait. He set to work with practiced calm, tearing cloth into neat bands and wrapping the limb with deliberate care. He coached Lila as he worked, voice low and economical. "Keep him steady, don't make him fight you," he said, showing how to bind without choking circulation. His hands moved with the quiet authority of experience, and the room tightened around routines that kept the crisis from widening. The wind tore at the roof, and water pooled where it should not. A corner of the shed lifted and sent splintered boards across the yard. Lila patched what she could, nailing and lashing until fingers ached and breath shortened. Emma carried lamps and warm water, offering small comforts that steadied more than soot and cloth. They worked in a focused rhythm that turned exhaustion into a row of tasks completed. Each motion a quiet refusal to be undone. When the rain slowed, rumors gathered like puddles. Margaret's allies said the injury proved Lila had overreached and offered conditional assistance that smelled of ownership. Jasper's men pushed offers tied to surrendering the girl's claim to the horse, and asking public favors in return. Lila folded such proposals into a private ledger and preferred action to argument. She would let labor answer the questions asked by gossip. Caleb reshaped the training into cautious increments. Gallops were postponed for careful walks and balance work. He taught Lila to read tiny signals, the coolness behind a knee, the softening around an eye, the pattern of breath that meant permission. Trust him, don't break him, he reminded her, and the line became a rule against impatience. They walked measured circles, asking Rusty for rhythm rather than speed, coaxing strength back through repetition and gentleness. Nights were watches. The pair took shifts holding lamps close while the horse rested, offering sips of water and soft words. Emma hummed a tune she had made up, and Lila learned to answer with a small laugh when she could, knitting humor to carry through strain. Those rituals mattered. They turned fear into shared cadence, and made recovery a communal action rather than a solitary endurance. Progress arrived as careful increments, a softer flinch, weight held for another second, a brief trot that did not end in collapse. Each improvement inspired modest celebration. A neighbor left a pie at the gate. A child tucked a bright ribbon onto the fence. Rose continued to slip salves and herbs when her aunt's back was turned. Small gestures added up, more valuable than a coin because they reaffirmed faith in effort rather than spectacle. Practical problems persisted. The local veterinarian demanded a fee they did not have, and race officials required documentation that would cost time and effort. Lila bartered chores for ointment and arranged a delayed entry request with the committee, citing the injury and asking for leniency. Caleb slipped a coin into her palm on a wet morning and told her to buy liniment and be prudent. She kept that coin next to her mother's photograph, a ledger of memory and trust that guided choices. Setbacks still stung. One morning a muddy gate made Rusty wobble, and Lila had to resist the urge to push him forward. Restraint became as important as courage. Each time she chose coaxing over command, the horse rewarded patience with steadier steps the next day. Caleb's lessons emphasized that recovery was arithmetic, small additions of care compounding into progress, not sudden leaps. The town began to shift its tone by degrees. Some who had bet against them adjusted lines and murmured new predictions. Margaret's exterior remained unreadable, but Rose's softened expression when she saw steady improvement. That quiet approval steadied Lila more than public applause ever could. Eventually, Caleb suggested a short, controlled gallop as a test. He marked a clear start and a restrained finish, instructing Lila only to maintain balance and breathe. Rusty lifted into a stride that felt cohesive, each hoof-fall matching the rhythm she set. They covered the distance Lila had once only imagined, and when they eased to a stop, Emma laughed until tears ran, their relief raw and bright. As they groomed the horse that evening, Caleb put a rough hand on Lila's shoulder and said, "When have you endured a storm?" That's the fire fueling Lila now. The question moved through the shed like a lantern passed from person to person. It called anyone listening to recall their own small defiance against hardship. It was not a demand for spectacle but an invitation to witness perseverance, to remember a time they had kept going when surrender seemed easier. Days moved into a rhythm of care, mornings for light exercise, afternoons for rest and grooming, evenings for mending tack and plan. Lila kept a small notebook of gains, jotting minutes of weight-bearing and when a flinch eased. That record became proof she could point to when doubt pressed. Emma marked signs, a sheen returning to a flank, a noise no longer sparking panic, and announced victories with a child's apparent pride. Caleb taught dignity, ask for aid without shrinking. He connected Lila to neighbors who would trade labor for feed and reminded her that the community could be leveraged when approached with respect. Rose's secret help grew steadier. She left a clean saddle and once a whispered encouragement that tightened resolve. Those private alliances built a safety net. One clear night, Lila sat on a crate and breathed, feeling tension loose. She watched Rusty stand steady and Emma curl into sleep, and understood endurance as the sum of small choices rather than lone heroics. The race would expose them to spectacle, yet now they approached it with practiced care, and a town beginning to listen truly. Dusk braided itself into the rafters of the shed, turning dust motes into slow, golden birds, while shadows lengthened across worn floorboards. Lila moved with a deliberate hush, tending tack and checking knots with a precision that turned ordinary chores into necessary liturgies. Survival had taught her to honor small things. Rose slipped through the gap in the fence, as if the night owed her secrecy, a satchel tucked under one arm and the faint scent of lavender clinging to her sleeves. She set the bag down and unrolled bundles of dried leaves, soft cloths and a narrow bottle of oil whose label had long faded. Her fingers worked with quiet assurance, practiced from years near stalls and stitches, and she named which plant eased swelling and which poultice drew heat from joints. Lila leaned forward to learn, absorbing instructions as a student collects language. Emma peered from the pallet, eyes wide in vulnerable gratitude. The act of tending felt like a private rebellion against the town's calculus of currency and cruelty, a small mercy tucked into ordinary life. Caleb arrived carrying a lantern and the weight of many seasons in the stoop of his shoulders. He settled on an overturned crate and reached into his coat to reveal a photograph edged in crease and sun. The image showed a younger rider astride a vivid horse, captured mid-stride with its mane flying and dust thrown like celebratory confetti. Caleb's voice sank into the story, the kind that folds memory into counsel. He spoke of Starfire's early years, a colt that ate speed for breakfast and moved through fields with an extra gear others could not find. Folks had called him a miracle because the animal carried a rhythm beneath rhythm, a cadence that pushed him past rivals when grit alone would not suffice. Lila listened until the lantern's glow made the photograph seem sacred, imagining a finish line she had only summoned in private. Rose's hands paused on a jar as she traced a seam in the fabric, the confession she offered next knit past and present. Rusty had once borne the name Starfire and belonged to her cousin. The admission forged a new line of loyalty between them, transforming the horse from burden into a vessel carrying a lost story. Near the shed mouth a shape paused and moved on, a ranch hand whose job often extended beyond mending fences to relaying what benefited those with pockets large enough to steer outcome. He lingered long enough to mark a fresh hoofprint and the smell of herbs, his shadow merging with a post and waiting like a smear of intent. Caleb set the photograph between them and tapped it as if on an anchor. That horse carried a name, he said, voice frayed with memory and old applause. Carried it like a man carries a stubborn faith. Rose's expression tightened as she thought of grief folded into manners, of promises spoken in private that hardened into brittle rules later. Lila felt a new shape of resolve gather inside her. The animal beneath her hand was no mere mount, but a chance braided with obligation. She traced a healed ridge on Rusty's flank and swore without sound to protect both creature and child with whatever she could muster. Outside, Dusty Hollow maintained its rhythm of clops and wagers, and the low hum of futures being bought on the margin. Still, inside a different tempo held, patient work, deliberate kindness. Rose whispered of an arrangement made after a family loss, a bargain meant to keep memory tethered that had ossified into ownership. That history made the present risky. Margaret could summon law dressed as aid and turn charity into change. Caleb counseled on strategy, weighing risk and reward in practical terms, where to practice, when to show progress, and when to keep movement private. He insisted that visible competence should be framed in a way that was small enough to sway doubtful hearts, but subtle enough to deny a legal pretext for seizure. Lila catalogued favors and allies in her head, Caleb's blunt expertise, Rose's quiet generosity, a neighbor or two who still honored small debts and rehearsed contingencies aloud so the plan would survive stress. Emma handed her a child's drawing of a finish line, the crude flags burning with hope. The simplicity steadied Lila more than any adult calculation, a reminder of what the fight really guarded. Unknown to them, the ranch hand had already walked back along the lane and folded his observations into a report aimed at stirring Margaret's appetite for control. He spoke of herbs, a photograph, and secret movements. His tone invited action rather than mercy. The threat ceased to be a rumor and became a pulse that might lead to papers, stamps, and appointed hands. Margaret's attention carried the precision of someone who administered consequence with the formality of a ledger. She could make kindness conditional and bind people with clauses that read like a system. The knowledge that an official claim could be lodged tightened Lila's strategy. She could not ignore threats of legal maneuvering. She had to make capture costly not only to them but to anyone who sought power by paper or performance. That calculus produced plans that turned pressure into preparation, practicing in public enough to accumulate undeniable proof of skill, placing witnesses where needed, and building a record of steady improvement that would complicate claims grounded in whim or convenience. Nightfall found them arranging watch shifts, tucking extra oats into sacks, and stashing tack beneath loose boards. Caleb instructed in patience more than force, shaping muscle memory with hands that steadied without taking authority. He showed Lila how to ask for rhythm instead of demanding acceleration, how to move as an extension of the horse so that motion felt chosen, not coerced. Rose wrapped a clean cloth around a jar of salve and offered a look that promised more aid in darker hours and less visibility when it mattered most. Those gestures wove a fragile net of safety, salves and coins and secrecy composing armor stitched from ordinary mercy. At one point a distant lantern bobbed along the manor lane, and the ranch hand's shadow paused beneath it, then retreated toward the house with a message already folded into the machinery of power. Inside the shed, however, a stubborn warmth gathered. An alliance had teeth when tended with patience, courage and careful deception if needed. Lila pressed her forehead to Rusty's warm neck and listened to the animal's steady breath as if mapping an ally's heartbeat. She vowed aloud to guard the small family they had formed. Emma, the horse and those who chose to stand with them, not because it erased inequality, but because a promise practiced daily sometimes changes outcomes more surely than a sudden revolt. When Caleb rose to go, he offered an awkward embrace that carried the weight of a promise more than affection. "Don't let suspicion become the thing that stops you," he muttered, voice cracked by long winters. "Keep what matters close and make the rest complicated to Rose folded her satchel and offered a quiet nod. Emma slept with a ragged blanket tucked up to her chin while Lila lay awake cataloging assets and weaknesses, sketching responses to summons and imagining how finish lines might be staged to leave no easy opening for seizure. Dawn would bring training and small public tests, a slow piling of facts that would force the town to admit what they had seen. For now, under lantern light, the bonds between them felt like armor fashioned from gratitude. A salve slid at midnight, a secret coin, a whispered oath at dusk. Together they planned to turn tenderness into strategy and hope into a carefully defended truth. Dusk made alleys long and ink-dark while a low wind carried the scent of challenge through Dusty Hollow. Coins changed hands under breath. Men with sour smiles offered little more than paper promises and softer math. Jasper Reed's envoys arrived like vultures in neat shirts, pockets bulging with currency meant to buy choices rather than loyalty. They approached the shed with measured steps, their boots tapping a rhythm that suggested an advantage, then halted where the light thinned and expectation narrowed. One man proffered a leather purse, cracked and heavy, the clink inside speaking volumes. "Take this," he said, voice oily with confidence. "Walk away, find food elsewhere. Keep the child safe and leave the horse to those with means." Lila's fingers curled into a fist that cradled resolve rather than surrender. She met his smile with a flat answer, "We don't trade hope for handouts." Outside the corral a shadow moved, blending into fence posts where gamblers whispered wagers and foresaw profit in retreat. Margaret Voss watched from her carriage with a composure built to shape other people's choices. She stepped down and walked with the gait of practiced command. Each heel strike stressed that consequences would follow defiance. "Withdraw," she said, tilted precisely and cold. The sentence settled over the yard like a seal. A hush fell, then talk seeped in, building pressure like water in a basin. Jasper's men tightened their offer, adding conditions intended to humiliate public renunciation. A promise never to enter certain grounds, and an admission that would render pity into proof. Lila considered each clause and folded private stakes into a choice she would answer by living rather than signing. She thought of Emma's soft breathing inside, the small things her refusal protected. Her mind shifted from fear to calculation. Caleb arrived at the periphery with a lantern and practical counsel, face lined by weather and the economy of labor. After the envoys drifted, he walked over and placed both palms on Lila's shoulders. "Hold ground. Don't trade tomorrow for a meal today," he said. His words steadied like anchors. They sketched a plan, visible improvement, witnesses who could attest to genuine restoration, and a record of progress that complicated legal predation. Rusty stood near, ears flicking, nostrils flaring as if he sensed negotiation's pulse. His gait had begun to carry authority, and a thin sheen now played across his flank where dust once clung like regret. Lila brushed him, fingers moving in deliberate patterns that soothed muscle and memory. She spoke to the animal in low syllables that stitched trust and motion together. Each stroke reinforced partnership. Each breath synced with the rhythm she rehearsed. Margaret's tone sharpened, and the threat took concrete form. She spoke of legal custody, shelter claims, and appointed hands who could activate paperwork with a signature. The terms sounded tidy and official, and listeners nodded as if bureaucracy could replace conscience. Lila pictured forms and stamps like weather, imminent and cold. She understood that accepting such a deal would save bolts and bread but cost agency and future choice. Resistance became a deliberate act of stewardship. The town's mockery swelled into louder predictions. Someone barked that the girl would never reach the starting line. Another wagered his hat that the beast would falter in front of proper stable. Yet pockets of support persisted. A neighbor left a tin of oats. A child pinned a ribbon to the corral as a talisman. Those tiny mercies knitted into a counterweight against institutional pressure and buyout promises. At night, Lila trained with a narrowed focus, turning every exercise into proof. She practiced controlled bursts so Rusty conserved strength for the right moment. Caleb timed sprints and recorded results in a ledger that smelled of dust and care, noting steady improvements with the stern satisfaction of a craftsman. Rose hovered at the edge, watching for any sign that Margaret's suspicion translated into action. Once she slipped a blanket toward the shed, quick and soft as shadow, and moved away before threats evolved beyond offers and papers. A ranch hand began to lurk by the lane, his presence a message folded into silence. He watched the training through slats, noted times and faces, and carried small details back to the house where power was concentrated. Lila recognized the angle of his gaze and adjusted routines to reduce exposure. She practiced at dawn and dusk when eyes were fewer and rotated witnesses so no single vantage could be controlled. Each tactical adaptation narrated survival. One evening the alley darkened, and voices rose like a bad wind. Margaret stepped close with a calm that implied adjudication. "I will not be mocked," she said. "Withdraw, and I will arrange shelter for the girls under my terms." Lila's reply carried the tone of someone who had measured weight against consequence. "Shelter that strings you to my name is not rest. It is debt," she answered. The retort cut but did not ignite theatrics. It made clear that dependence on decorated charity was unacceptable. Rusty stepped forward then, nostrils flaring at the scent of tension. His movement was steady, and his gaze found Lila with a confidence earned through patience. In that instant the crowd shifted, recalibrating the value of a life in motion compared to charity tied to conditions. Some faces softened, others hardened, betting on whichever outcome promised profit. Caleb placed his hand on Lila's shoulder and spoke for a pragmatic purpose. "Remember why you chose this," he said. "This is not defiance for its own sake. It is about claiming a chance that belongs to someone else's memory and making it yours." His counsel reframed resistance as stewardship. Lila inhaled, felt resolve settle into her muscles and pictured the finish line as a narrow gate that would open to a future forged by careful choices. The envoys left with coins that did not buy obedience and murmurs that might later produce paperwork. Margaret retreated with a careful step, mind working through formalities that could unmake an unpaid family. Rusty stamped the ground, and Lila brushed his flank until motion calmed fur and fear alike. Emma watched from the doorway, expression small and brave, and Lila promised inwardly to stand against compromises that ate dignity. Outside Dusty Hollow kept counting wagers, unaware that something more than a race was unfolding. On yards and porches, people debated values, whether mercy should come with strings attached, whether power was a license for control, or whether a community could witness courage and choose to uphold it. Those conversations, quiet as they were, promised to matter when the starting bell rang. Night found the shed lit by a single lamp and wrapped in resolve. Lila adjusted tack, checked girth and balance, and rehearsed starts in her head until breath and motion matched. Rusty responded with a softness that had cost them both patience to earn. The town's wagers would keep coming, but so would small hands that offered aid. The choice had become visible: surrender for immediate comfort or endure for durable freedom. Have you stood tall when surrender was easier? Lila's fight is heating up. Stand with her, recall a time you chose courage over comfort, and let that memory guide the choices you make now. Always. Race morning arrived like a held breath released. A low sun painting the track in copper and shadow while people gathered with faces turned to the dirt and pockets packed of wagers. Lila mounted with hands that trembled only a little, fingers closing on reins she had learned to trust. Beside her the animal's flank shone with a patient sheen, its muscles gathering under a scarred hide like coiled rope. Competitors lined up in disciplined rows, glossy mounts stamped and tossed their heads and the air hummed with expectation. Emma stood at the rail, cheeks flushed and eyes enormous, clutching a scrap of ribbon that trembled in her fist. Rose leaned against the fence, wetness she could not hide making tracks down her cheekbones, and Caleb stood a few paces back with jaw set like a hinge. Dusty Hollow seemed to hold its breath as flags fluttered and a starter lifted a hand. The first gallop was fierce, hooves striking the earth with a percussion that opened the space between present and past. Lila felt each impact through saddle and bone, counting rhythm as if it were an old language. The crowd's voices rose and fell like wind through canyons, part encouragement, part calculation. At the first bend, sleek horses surged ahead, designed for burst and praise. Rusty responded not by matching raw speed but by finding a cadence that moved him forward without straining. Lila nudged with subtle weight shifts and low words threaded with trust. The steed answered with a lengthening stride that carried more than momentum. It carried determination honed through patient work and careful mending. Midway through the course, a rival lunged, aiming to break a line and challenge balance. For an instant the world narrowed to the rhythm of breathing and the press of hooves. Lila set her shoulders, centered herself in her seat and rode with a calm that steadied her momentum. The mount found a seam between competitors, slipping through a gap that looked impossibly small until motion made it wide. The crowd gasped, surprise reshaping expectation. A sudden gust kicked dust across the track, stinging eyes and blurring edges. Lila kept her hands steady, feeling the animal's flank tighten and then relax under the command that asked for trust over force. Each stride unspooled a memory of nights spent practicing, of Caleb's patient guidance and Rose's secret salves in those private hours stitched into public pace, turning doubt into proof. Approaching the home straight, the finish line unfolded like a promise, colors snapping in the light. The leader's mount began to falter, lungs burning from earlier bursts. Rusty's breath came in regular, controlled puffs, conditioned by measured training rather than wild sprinting. Lila leaned forward, offering balance rather than force, murmuring a phrase that had become their talisman. The animal responded as if recalling its own memory, pushing with a power that rose from deep within rather than from panic. With each bounding footfall, they drew even with the leader, then edged ahead in a surge that felt as inevitable as sunrise. The crowd's sound broke into a roar that carried both disbelief and delighted relief. Emma's shout cut through the din, high and bright, and Rose's hand flew to her mouth. Caleb's face loosened into a grin that held water behind it. For a breath, the race existed only as a line and two hearts, one human and one animal, beating in sync. They crossed the tape and won by a margin so small it felt sacred. The immediacy of victory washed over them in the faces at the rail, astonishment, shame for earlier cruelty, and then a rising cheer that felt like permission to hope. Margaret stood across the field, her lips pressed together, her posture unrateable. The sight of her quietness shifted the crowd into murmurs, as old hierarchies rearranged against newfound proof. Lila slid from the saddle with knees that shook and hands that knew the work they had done. She slid her palm along the mount's neck, feeling heat and strength and an answered trust. The horse wet-nosed her as if acknowledging a shared feat, and Emma surged forward, throwing herself at both rider and animal in a tangle of relief. Neighbors offered hands, food and tentative congratulations. Children crowded near to touch the flank, eyes shining with the kind of awe that seeds belief. Rose took Lila's hand with a grip that spoke of solidarity and new belonging. Caleb clapped a heavy hand on Lila's back and said little, his pride conveyed through a smile that softened with tears. The victory altered the possibility. Training programs formed in tentative conversation. An older neighbor suggested donations rather than conditional charity. Youngsters asked for lessons. Lila listened, feeling the town unfurl into opportunities she had once only sketched on paper. Later, as light thinned, townspeople formed a loose ring and traded accounts of the race, each perspective sharpening what bravery looked like. An older woman remembered a winter when mercy had been scarce and offered a loaf to the girl. A young rider asked if Lila would teach balance, eyes brightened by the possibility. Conversations that once centered on ownership shifted to repair and instruction. Neighbors proposed a modest fund for tack and feed, promised to steward any aid so it served many, not merely one. In a quiet moment, Emma sat with ribbon in lap, eyes bright and shoes dusty, and asked a small question that carried future weight. Do we stay? Lila considered the town she had fought within and the future she had earned by sweat and guile. The answer came slow and sure. She pictured mornings where the Mount's shadow led children through learning ground and afternoons where fairness tempered power. That evening the crowd thinned, leaving a hush broken only by animals settling into barns. Lila walked the track with the steed at her side, each step measured, each hoofball a testament to endurance. Rose followed with a blanket slung over an arm, and Caleb brought a small jug of water that tasted like relief. As twilight gave way to night, neighbors gathered around a fire and shared stories of past days, of losses and lessons. Margaret watched from a distance, then approached with a posture altered by the witness. Her words were few and edged with something like contrition. She extended an offer wrapped in humility, and the town listened as power shifted into a more shared language. Lila accepted practical aid but refused demeaning terms, negotiating a space that preserved dignity while building new stability. Children learned to ride, elders advised, and Rusty, once dismissed, stood as a symbol of reclaimed worth. In the afterglow, Caleb nodded toward the assembled neighbors and asked, voice steady, when did you believe in the impossible? That's the heart of this moment. The question rippled outward, inviting reflection and connection. For Lila the race had been a hinge, for Dusty Hollow it was a mirror that required honest looking. The victory was not an end, but a beginning, a proof that patience, allied with courage, can bend a future towards something kinder and more just. The finished tape's flutter dissolved into a roar that folded the town in on itself, and for a moment, Dusty Hollow held an unguarded breath. Rusty stood with flanks heaving, neck arched like a banner. Lila slid from the saddle, knees trembling, and Emma ran forward with arms that barely held joy. Around them people pressed in, voices layering into a noise that rewrote reputations. Some faces showed contrition so fresh it shone with sincerity. Margaret moved through that crowd with measured steps, as if each footfall weighed private reckonings. She paused at the rail and met the girl's eyes not with calculation but with something softer. I misjudged what mattered, she said, voice stripped of performance. Stewardship demands humility. The words landed, and a few listeners shifted. She reached into her pocket and offered a simple plan: a room at the ranch, paid work teaching basic horse care, and funding for a modest youth training program. The proposal aimed to preserve dignity rather than exploit it. Lila held the offer like a coin, turning it by thought. Could acceptance secure safety without surrender? Neighbors answered before she chose. Blankets appeared, and pies were handed out. Older riders asked Caleb about organizing regular lessons. Rose stood beside Lila, her hands steady and a new pride stitched into her expression. Practical kindness moved faster than ceremony. The ranch fitted a spare room above the tack area, and assigned a stable hand to mentor chores. Margaret pledged modest funds for feed and farrier visits without strings attached. Lila was given a weekly slot to teach balance and basic care. Rusty presented as a calm, living classroom instead of a spectacle. Donations from townsfolk became a small fund to cover emergencies. Lila taught with patience honed by hardship. Children came with apprehension and bright hope, wearing patched clothes and eager hands. She showed them how to mount gently, find balance through breath and subtle adjustments, and speak softly so that the animals would answer without fear. Mistakes were corrected with calm direction. Small victories were celebrated with quiet smiles. Rusty accepted curious fingers and clumsy saddling, his temperament steady as if he understood the role he now played. Parents watched reserve bloom into possibility and began quietly contributing. A sack of oats, repaired tack, mended shirts. The rescue spread outward until what began as a private effort felt like a communal recovery. Margaret shifted from distant authority to practical steward. She opened ranch gates for cleanup days, funded a scholarship for promising riders who would share winnings with the community fund, and learned to give without condition. Those gestures did not erase old hardness, but created new norms anchored in shared labor. Even Jasper Reed found a path to civic participation, proposing a family ride day that would both advertise his business and support the youth program. Profit bent into contribution when incentives aligned. Daily routine smoothed the town's rough edges. Emma grew fuller with steady food and rest. Her small hands learned to braid and tie knots. Lila found her weight eased through shared burdens, the constant strain giving way to coordinated care. Their days stitched work and learning into ordinary life. Rusty, once a symbol of neglect, became the heart of the program. Children learned to read his moods. He stood patient with nervous beginners and bowed briefly when balance came. Lila told short stories about resilience as kids traced the horse's scarred flank, and those tales sowed memory into new possibilities. A modest dedication in autumn marked the change. Caleb organized a field gathering and a wooden sign was set by the corral bearing the program's name. Margaret cut the ribbon, neighbors clapped, and some wiped away tears. Lila stood with Rose and Emma and felt the community's promise settle into place. Legacy arrived as a shared obligation rather than a trophy. The training program offered lessons and provided small stipends to instructors, while the communal fund covered unexpected veterinary care. Margaret learned to speak generosity in ways that did not demand repayment. Caleb found renewed purpose in teaching. Rose coordinated matches between riders and suitable mounts. Years later, the story traveled beyond the county. Lila led youths to regional meets, teaching competence over trophies. Emma mended tack with steady hands and no longer showed hunger's sharpness. Rusty slowed with age yet remained central to every lesson. His gait carried a living archive of recovery. In quiet moments, Lila kept a faded photograph, a boy and his horse from another time, and sometimes showed it to pupils to anchor humility in history. She thought of the first night she had pressed her forehead to a scarred neck and felt stubborn courage move between them. That feeling had grown into a practice. Steady work, shared care and small choices that multiplied. Standing by the corral one late afternoon, watching a child find balance and grin, Lila felt gratitude deepen into resolve. She looked at Rose's smile and realized the town had remade itself around a truer measure of value. Rusty, once cast aside, stood in the center as proof that second chances when protected multiply. A simple curriculum formed from practical needs, balance drills, tack care, safety checks, and small rituals teaching respect. Caleb mapped sessions into patient steps, showing beginners how to feel a gait instead of forcing posture. He demonstrated subtle weight shift. Rose taught salves and basic first aid by lantern light, instructing children how to spot heat and patch a nick. Kids learned to braid manes, tighten girths, and read a horse's eye. Local trades pitched in. The blacksmith held open hours for discounted shoeing. The feed store agreed to credit small purchases for program members. Neighbors rotated chores so emergency bills would not fall on one family. A volunteer roster emerged, with veteran riders teaching balance while others focused on calm handling and trust exercises. Those exchanges built a network based on competence and mutual obligation. The youth program gained notice. Regional trainers visited and found riders whose steadiness surprised them, as well as pupils who excelled because lessons emphasized care over raw speed. An invitation to a modest regional meet arrived. Lila took a small team. They returned with practical pride. Winnings were placed into the communal fund to support others. That reinvestment turned private achievement into public fuel. Margaret adjusted her stance in increments. She began attending classes without direction, listening while neighbors explained their needs. She funded a scholarship for a promising student with community oversight and opened her doors for workdays, replacing aloof charity with shared labor. Some elders remained wary, but most accepted that accountability mattered more than grand gestures. Community celebrations grew from honest labor, a fall tidy-up with supper, a winter drive collecting coats, a barn dance raising funds. Dusty Hollow's reputation shifted. Neighbors told the story not as legend, but as a record of steady choices that repaired strain into structure. Lila kept a ledger of favors and expenditures, insisting on transparency so that aid could not become a form of control. Her insistence preserved dignity. Rusty aged with grace, and the program taught generations a truth. Patient care expands possibility when a community chooses to steward rather than seize. If Lila and Rusty's triumph moved you, drop a 0 or 1 below. Subscribe for more stories of grit that'll keep you hooked.